Hello, everyone. The diminuendo means I think it's about time for me to start talking. And the great thing about Tortoise members is they keep you on your toes. About 30 seconds ago, I got a heads up on breaking news, which I'm waiting to appear on my phone, which may influence our conversation. But anyway, I'm Giles Whittell. I am an editor here at Tortoise. And this is our regular Friday lunchtime Sensemaker Live Think-In with Santander, for whose support we are very grateful. I say regular, but it's not regular. Today and for the next two Fridays, we're going to be talking about America and the election that Donald Trump likes to say is the most important of all our lives. And who knows, he may be right. Next week, we're going to be talking about America and COVID. The week after that, we're going to be talking about American culture and values insofar as we can discern them from this distance. We hope we'll be getting some help from the States. But today, we're going to be talking about America and the world. And I'd like to start with a confession, which is that I feel that writing the framing question or headline and blurb for this session was too easy, and it's probably too pat. You'll have to forgive me for beacon of nope, but the everything else after all these years of these 4 years of American foreign policy, if it can be described as such, under Trump, was too easily summarized as in the negative. But let's focus on the question: what does America still stand for that will define its place in the next 4 years and beyond? I mean, I hope that under that umbrella, over the course of the next hour, we can get to whether we perhaps in liberal echo chambers or liberal conservative echo chambers have exaggerated the damage that Trump, that may have been done to America's standing and influence in the world over the past 4 years. If not, what can be done to fix it? And in either case, who are the rivals? Not just Xi and China, though clearly that's a big part of it. But is there a new contest for leadership of the free world? We have really an all-star cast. I was thinking that if some of them were to share a dodgy plate of seafood spaghetti, then the eyes of Europe on America would be blinded until they'd recovered. But we'll get to them in just a second. For those of you who are not used to think-ins, please remember, please know that one of the most important things is that you all get involved. There are two ways to do that: by raising your electronic hand. See the black bar at the bottom of your screens, which comes alive when you play with your mouse. Click on chat and you will see at the bottom right-hand corner, click on participants, and you will see at the bottom right-hand corner your raise hand button. And next to participants is chat. And please get involved in the chat. My colleague Ella is in there too. And we may come to those of you who say interesting things in the chat, though there's no obligation, obviously. I want to dive straight in. Sometimes we do sort of digital muscle flexing with sort of questions for everybody raising a hand, but I want to come straight to Anne Applebaum, who for most of us will need no introduction. Pulitzer-prize winning author of, among many other tremendous books, Gulag. I know that's a long time ago, Anne, but and a writer at The Atlantic. And recently you have written about the American-Chinese relationship, and I want to get to that in just a second. But first, can we come to the broader question? Do you think that there is a risk of exaggerating the damage that has been done to American standing in the world over the past 4 years? But either way, can it be fixed?
So thank you for that very broad and open-ended question, which there are many different ways to answer. It depends on what you think American standing is. I mean, is there a risk to America's status as the most important military power in the world? No, that's not at risk. Is there Is there a risk to America's status as the most important economic power in the world? No, that's obviously not at risk either. I mean, there are many other countries that are catching up. In the expression "the rise of the rest" was once just used to describe what's happening to others. So the U.S. is not as far ahead as it once was, but it's still unquestionably extremely important, and its voice therefore continues to matter in all kinds of spheres. And we should, you're absolutely right that we should never forget that. But one thing that the US had in the past, which had been actually suffering for some time, even before Trump became president, was a reputation as, I think you even used this phrase in your introduction, as the leader of the democratic world, or the leader of the free world, or the world's most important democracy. And that the US had a status as not exactly as a model, but as an inspiration for other Democrats and would-be Democrats all over the world. It was the country that people in places like Belarus and Bahrain turned to when they wanted, when they wanted to be inspired, or people in Hong Kong. I think people in Hong Kong demonstrations have even waved US flags in the past as a way of associating themselves with ideas and ideals of democracy and freedom. Has the US suffered as a symbol of those things? Yes, and really quite profoundly. And you don't have to just believe my opinion. You can look at you look at polling that's been done all over the world. I don't have it at my fingertips right now, but I think there's a recent Pew poll that asks what people think of the United States and do they admire the president and so on. And the drops are really dramatic. I mean, by 50%, 60% in a whole range of countries. Very often, very specifically to do with Trump. And there are questions as to, for example, who do you trust more? And there are a number of surprising countries in the Democratic camp whose populations now trust Putin and Xi more than they trust Trump. Right. And that's just an objective measurement of how people feel. And that is going to be extremely difficult to recover from, because it's not so much his specific policies in specific places, it's his attitude to the office, it's his abuse of public servants and civil servants, it's his abuse of the rule of law inside the United States, his misuse of the Justice Department, which he's used for private matters, his refusal to testify and to allow his officials to testify in front of Congress, breaking all kinds of precedents. His manner, yes, his erratic behavior, his retweeting even recently of conspiracy theory, all those kinds of things have impacted the impression of the US as a stable, sensibly run democracy. That you may or may not disagree with some of its views, but at least it had an admirable political system. And that, I think, is severely damaged. And whether it can be resurrected by a Biden presidency, I don't know. There will be a lot of countries, both our allies and our enemies, who will be very, very wary of any US president in the future, particularly, as they know that a Trump successor, I don't know, Don Jr. or Tucker Carlson, or someone else could be the next president. And so the idea that this kind of American leadership is possible, which none of us would have believed before we saw it, I think has damaged US standing for the very long term.
Can I just pick you up on the point of the manner, which I know was one of a long list of points you made there. But surely if you do have a change of leadership, you have a change of manner almost literally in a heartbeat. And that is reversed right away. And in a sense, the fact that you have that change of leadership, if you do, it itself is a pretty powerful message to people watching from Russia or China, isn't it?
Yes, it's a message. And one of the reasons why it's important that Biden wins is that would be an endorsement of American democracy and of the sense of, the reasonableness of the American electorate. And it would have, it would definitely have a good impact. I mean, I've had people in as varied places as, Minsk and Warsaw and Caracas tell me that they're hoping for a Biden victory just because it will, in innumerable and unnameable and intangible ways, it will help the causes of democracy in their countries. And so, yes, it will matter. But as I say, what will remain is the awareness that an erratic and irresponsible leader was possible, and therefore it could happen again.
Right.
And particularly if, a lot depends on what happens inside the Republican Party over the next couple of years, but particularly if the party doesn't prove itself capable of regeneration, if it chooses as its next leaders, a kind of a new Trumpist, a Tom Cotton or as I say, in the worst case scenario, Don Jr., then you will have people fearing that, oh no, we have this rational and understandable and comprehensible America, but we could still get a nutty America again. And therefore we need to be very, very careful what kind of deals we do. We need to hedge our bets. And, as I wrote recently in the article in The Atlantic that you're referring to, maybe we need to keep on side with China just in case, because you never know how these things are going to work out. And you won't get the automatic respect for American leadership that you would have had, 4 years ago or 10 years ago.
Right. I want to come in a second to Ella's slides because they illustrate some of the sort of concrete empirical points that you were mentioning there. But just before I let you go right now, Anne, you started by mentioning two metrics by which the US remains, in your view, unassailable: military status and economic status. I'm really struck. We're not devoting this hour to China, but I'm struck how in the past 4 years the price of doing business with China has been, for example, to blend, if you're an airline, Taiwan into your map of China. And that's been a price that corporates have been willing to pay. The price of doing business with China as a country has been to not recognize Taiwan as an independent country, for example. Those are the kinds of examples of clout that we used to associate with the US exclusively, I think. And I just wanted to push back slightly on the idea that the America's economic status is unassailable. I mean, even in terms of purchasing power parity as opposed to sort of regular GDP, China's way up there as a rival already, isn't it?
Sure. But I wasn't denying that. I was just saying that you can't discount the U.S. economy. I mean, it's not as if it's disappeared or diminished or vanished, and it's still the source of all kinds of creativity and innovation and so on. But yes, absolutely, you're right. One of the effects of China's rising economic power and its military expansion is also that it has a kind of political clout that it didn't used to have, including the clout to erase the existence of Taiwan on the maps, including the clout to make U.S. companies go along with its laws and rules in a way that we would have thought unimaginable a few years ago. So yes, you're right. I mean, that's there. I just wanted to stress that, you can't. It's not as if Trump made the U.S. disappear. I mean, that is a
Right.
grotesque, exaggeration of what's happened.
Yeah, fair enough. Can we go to the pictures, Ella? Talk us through the slides, and then we'll come to Julian if he's with us, or Greg if he's not.
All right, let's get going. So I think that this slide speaks to what Anne was saying about the US and its reputation. And these are some of those figures from that Pew poll, the Global Attitude Survey that she mentioned. So in European nations surveyed by the poll, confidence in Trump to do the right thing in terms of global affairs has remained low pretty much throughout his presidency. As you can see from some of those fluctuations between Bush and Obama's presidencies, this confidence has recovered in the past. But I think what we're getting at in this discussion, as Anne said, is whether it will be able to rebound again in the same way. And this low level of confidence in Trump and America more broadly hasn't been helped by America's approach to the coronavirus pandemic. So in that same Pew survey, 84% of people around the world who were surveyed thought that the US had handled it either somewhat badly or very badly. This slide shows over the last four years that the US has pulled out of numerous big international agreements, including trade deals, the INF treaty with Russia, and the International Paris Agreement on Climate Change, among others. And here we are taking a look at the makeup of the National Security Council, and that has changed a lot under Trump. So in only one term, there have been 4 different national security advisors and 2 different secretaries of state. Across his 2 terms, Obama had 1 secretary of state per term and 3 different national security advisors. For diplomatic partners and allies looking on, the frequent changes to these senior positions under Trump might make this body look somewhat unstable, perhaps. Trump's secretaries of state have visited these countries most frequently over the last 4 years. And the countries they've visited speak to some of those foreign policy points that have been important during Trump's presidency. So we've had the normalization of relations between the UAE and Israel, tensions with Iran, US relations with North Korea changing, and so on. And that is it from me.
Thank you very much, Ella. I can't help being struck by how there is a residual difference in faith in the US on the part of the Brits as compared with other Europeans. I'm not seeing Julian Borgia from The Guardian in the participants list. If you're there, Julian, do raise your digital hand. I want to come to Ian Baruma in a bit, but first to Greg Swenson from Republicans Abroad and reigning monarch of civilized disagreement. Let's be honest. You've become quite a regular at Tortoise Thinkings, and we love having you. Greg, Anne made an interesting point in reference to Trump's family members, Tucker Carlson et al. Whatever happens on November the 3rd, Trumpism isn't going away, is it? The base isn't going away. He discovered something about your great country. In a sense, in the same way that Rupert Murdoch discovered an audience for Fox. So are we just going to have to get used to a slightly different America? Are we going to have to recalibrate?
Probably. It would be hard to disagree with that, because even if the Republican Party, dials it down a bit, and the next leader is not, I don't imagine anyone could be quite as volatile and unfiltered as this president, and unless it was Don Jr. Although I have never heard that until Ann mentioned it. So and the audio was a little funky there, so I didn't actually hear the part about Tucker Carlson. But Ann brought up a good point. If it's Tom Cotton and even a Mike Pompeo, I think you can look at those two as people that are sort of worked into the mold and have bought in completely to the new sort of Trump philosophy of governing. But I think even if the party returned to some more traditional candidates, it's like a Nikki Haley, who you could argue is a more mainstream or moderate Republican. I don't think this goes away, and I think we can all agree that he's sort of captured. He captured something that was going on already. Maybe it started in 2010 with the Tea Party, and came and stayed strong through the Obama years with the the big midterm elections in 2010 and 2014. But it sort of flipped the traditional right-left metrics, and all of a sudden the Republicans have been the party of the worker and the anti-war party, which is interesting. And I don't mean to suggest they have a lock on being anti-war. I mean, I think both parties, you could argue now. Whereas, you'd always sort of thought of the Republicans as the ones that would be the first to pull the trigger and didn't really care about the workers. They were country club Republicans and free trade, and it was all about making money. This president, he's very much a business person and still wants to do deals and wants to do, expand the economic footprint, but he realizes that body bags are a bad optic for politicians on the right or the left. So I don't think that will change. I don't think you're going to see someone quite as unfiltered and disruptive as Trump, but I don't think it's going away either. I think it started in 2010 and 14. I think Trump just captured it better than the other candidates did.
And in terms of less personality-based, more lasting institutional damage to the US, let me come back to the question I posed earlier. Do you think there is a risk that observers looking in from outside, as we do, attribute more to Trump and his ability to trash the brand than we should? It is a big country. Its relationships with every continent are complex. Their state. They're not just from the federal government. They're certainly not just from between one individual and the rest of the world. I mean, is your sense as an American Republican living here, do you find that you are defending a different sort of country, and do you think that will last, or do you see a bounce back to the old way that America was seen?
It's tricky. I mean, I remember when Bush was president, they didn't like him at all. I thought that was an interesting chart that you showed a few minutes ago, with how Obama was just worshipped in Europe and the rest of the world. He was a great orator. He was a great diplomat. Looking back, that Bush wasn't exactly popular. And when I was here in the 80s, they were burning Reagan in effigy in the streets, for, I don't know, couldn't figure out why, for liberating, Eastern Europe from the Soviets. So, there's always going to be perception. And I don't argue that his unfiltered nature doesn't sell well in the rest of the world when he's polling, in the 20s or 30s in Europe, and yet he's polling, at 45 or even up to 50 in the US. So I think a lot of the voters and the citizens in the US have a much different view on what he's doing. And I think I'd also argue that, this whole America First thing, a lot of its campaign slogan, it's a way to get elected. People vote with their wallets, that's an age-old thing. But what's good for America isn't necessarily bad for the rest of the world. And the fact that, he's led with economics and doing business deals, it reminds me a little bit of the agreement in Northern Ireland 25 years ago, that let's start with business and try to avoid conflict. And the contrary to the, again, messaging is important. I wish he'd do a better job at it, because I would prefer that people support him here. But just two quick notes. One is that, contrary to what his messaging delivers, he's talking about America first and, make America great again. I get that. It doesn't sell well in the rest of the world, but what they're doing in the developing countries right now with American taxpayer balance sheet, for example, the US DFC, the big DFI in Washington, he doubled their balance sheet from 30 to 60 billion. They're piling tons of money into Africa. I do a lot of business in Africa, so I know it very well. And it's pretty inspiring to see the economic footprint and the development capital that's going into regions like that. And is it pushing out the Chinese? Yeah, sure. I think that these countries would much prefer American and other Western capital over Chinese capital. And you saw what happened in the last 10 years with the China economic expansion, and that's been exposed. And I think that's one credit you can give the president.
Is it on the same scale as Chinese investment? I mean, the Belt and Road infrastructure investment is colossal.
It is, but the American investment has always been there. It's just not as notable. And America is still the biggest investor in Africa. So it's just that I don't think we message it well. Some of the people in Washington are messaging it well. And the people at DFC and USAID and Millennium Challenge Corp are doing as good a job as they can. They're not probably getting the same sort of messaging from the top, from the president, but they are doing it, and he's behind it. He's encouraging it. And so, and the other thing I've noticed too is the change in the sort of structure of the political situation, the metrics in the US, where, as I mentioned, all of a sudden the Republicans are the party of the anti-war party and the party of the worker. It's similar to what happened here in the UK with Brexit. And, when I know that he and the country is not polling well in the West, but when I talk to people that work for a living, I have not met a taxi driver in London who doesn't love the president. I mean, it's amazing how that works. So, could the messaging be better? Yeah, I would prefer to poll at 70 than poll at 30. There's no doubt about that.
You're a black cab rider, not an Uber rider. I know that.
Yeah, that's safe to say. But I do both, and
right.
But I do sort of enjoy the banter of the black taxi, and I'm too tall for Ubers anyway, so that's why I use taxis.
Okay. You can stretch out in the back of a Prius. Well, thank you, Greg. I want to come to Ian now, but I have noticed in the chat, Caroline's iPhone. We don't know your surname, or I don't, but I would like to come back to you if possible, because you've taken issue with Greg's assessment of the impact of US investment in Africa. It'd be great to come back so you can pick up on that. But first, Ian Baruma, author, former editor of the New York Review of Books, America Watcher extraordinaire, although you're not are you a citizen, Ian? Let's unmute you. Still not hearing.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better.
No, American citizen au contraire, as Beckett once said when he was asked whether he was British.
Well, look, I want to hit you with a two-parter, general and specific. The general is where we started. What, in your view, does America still stand for that will define its place over the next 4 years and beyond? That's the general part. And the specific part is, I'd like you also to talk about the Anglo-American relationship. I'm not going to use the dreaded phrase, but you've written about it in the Churchill Complex recently. And I'd really like to know your take on how that evolves under the next president, whoever it might be.
Well, first of all, if what America stands for has anything to do with what black cabbies tell you in their banter, I think we're in for a very rough time. I don't think that they should be taken as a model for anything. I've heard them myself and try to stay quiet and keep my head down. I think in the discussion so far, people have been speaking about America too much in isolation, because I think what's been happening there has been happening in many other countries too. It's just more dramatic in America, partly because the electoral system, when in a two-party system, one party gets taken over by a particular radical wing, the consequences are greater than in systems where people have to form multi-party coalitions. But what it is, it's a revolt, a popular revolt against the elites. And this has been happening all over the Western world. And the elites in the United States are the country club Republicans, those moderate Republicans that we all hope might come back one day, as well as the Democrats. And it's not quite true, I don't think, what Greg Swenson says, that the Republicans are always the first ones to pull the trigger. On the contrary, it's often been the liberal elites, the Democrats, who got America into wars, often foolish wars, that I write about in the Churchill Complex, with presidents, starting with JFK, seeing themselves as sort of latter-day Churchills, getting America into wars supposedly to fight for freedom and democracy in the world. And the last war of that kind, and in my view, one of the most disastrous as far as America's reputation is concerned, was the Iraq War, and which was done by people who, from the point of view of sort of modern radical Republicans, would have still been associated with the more moderate wing, the Bushes, I mean. So I think it's a revolt because the elites in America stand for foolish wars, for not listening to the common people, for supporting Wall Street, and so on and so forth. Whereas in Britain, the Brexiteers associate the elites with the EU, with immigration, with multiculturalism, and so on. So what's happened everywhere on the continent of Europe too is this great revolt, and that's happened in the United States. It's not going to go away, but it might not last quite as long as we think either.
So can I pick you up on that?
Yeah.
So do you see, as a result of the fact, so take your advice, and not see the US in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
The revolt against the elites being a global, not a national phenomenon, ironically. Do you see a new pattern of American alliances emerging that may not be formal and diplomatic, but alliances of fellow feeling, not just between Trumpers and Brexiteers, but between Trump supporters and, let's name them, those who support wholeheartedly Duterte, Modi, Bolsonaro? Is there the foundation for a new pattern of American alliances there? Or is that populism peaking already?
Well, I hope so. I think it would be a disaster if that were to be the case, if there were indeed to be a sort of Tom Cotton as a president, and you got a kind of worldwide alliance based on mutual sympathies of authoritarian strongmen. It could happen, but those alliances can be shaky too. I mean, we saw that in the 1930s when there were different kinds of fascist governments in power all over the world. You even had an axis of Japan and Germany and Italy, but actually those alliances were not based on a great deal. I mean, they were shaky. It's not something to be looked forward to, and I don't think it's probably going to happen. But whatever the alliance of the Western world is going to look like, based on sort of shared democratic values, one hopes, it won't go back to the way it was before the Iraq War, or even before 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Empire. It'll be something different, and it has to be, and this is where Trump has a point, it has to be based on something a bit more, less lopsided than the Anglo-American or the American order has been since World War II. And by that I mean is that the deal that was made after the war with Western Europe and Japan and South Korea too, that the rest of the world, well, the American allies could concentrate on rebuilding their economies and getting rich while the Americans took care of our security. I think that's nearing an end. It's fraying very, very badly. And it can only be repaired if the Europeans and the Japanese and others start thinking much more seriously about their future, that would be much less completely dependent on the United States for its security. And the one good thing about Trump is that it's concentrated minds a bit in Europe, particularly. And so far, it's just words and thoughts and thinking and so on. But at some point, I think the Europeans really do have to think seriously about their own security. And
right.
Where that leaves Britain, of course, is another question.
If you were able to strip out the personality of Trump and look at his rhetoric, for example, on non-US NATO defense spending, it's been remarkably consistent and arguably quite successful in forcing the rest of NATO to step up and spend more, hasn't it?
Yes, except he consistently misunderstands how NATO works and how military budgets are made in different countries. I mean, I think the basic point that countries like Germany, France, and so on have to do more financially and otherwise on organizing their own defense I think is well taken. But whether he's the man to, let's think of another historical analogy, which is very inexact, but it might help us think, which is that before 1914, it was already becoming clear that the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a very good empire in many ways, but was fraying very badly and was at some point going to have to end. But the way it was ended in 1918 was, of course, a disastrous way, thanks largely to Woodrow Wilson. And set the scene for much worse things to take the place of the empire. Now, one can only hope that something like that is not going to happen with the Western alliance. I think the Western alliance does have to be reformed. I think America's allies do have to step up, but not in an atmosphere of panic and chaos that could be created by a Trump-like figure.
Thank you very much. Now, I promised that we would try to go to Catherine's iPhone because you made a very pointed objection, in a sense, to Greg's point about the US and Africa. It's sometimes hard to go to an iPhone. Are we able to do that?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. My name's Caroline Ogneven. I'm in Massachusetts in America, and I'm a research fellow at the Africa Center for Strategic Progress. So I do have some knowledge of America's investments in Africa. I think that saying that the Trump presidency has been good for Africa plays into what I believe is a pernicious narrative of aid development, wherein how much money we give in aid to certain countries, whether it's an investment or just straight up aid, counts as sort of developing these countries. And I think that it's really the inverse that's true. It's that countries of the global south are developing our economies in the way in which we exploit their labor and their economies by subjecting them to really unfair illicit flows. And while we do give a lot of aid and through money, the illicit financial flows from Africa are reported to be causing them to lose 3.7% of Africa's collective GDP each year. And clearly President Trump is not solely to blame for that. That's through a historical setup of inequality. However, Trump's corporate tax cuts have given twice as many companies the ability to pay zero taxes each year. And so I think it would be reductionist to simply look at how much aid is going out without seeing the bigger picture of how our corporations are able to exploit Trump's tax cuts. And he knows that. He's set it up very carefully. Furthermore, I think it's really important that we look at the way in which we have peacemaking interests in Africa, because I think the best example would be Somalia and Al-Shabaab, which is controlling their southernmost region really brutally, really violently, and clearly needs intervention. However, in the course of the coronavirus, they were able to recruit so many more people because people have needed aid, they've needed support. A lot of people have been forced to migrate internally due to soil degradation caused by climate change. And so people are going to join Al-Shabaab and it's violent, it's horrible, of course, but Al-Shabaab at the same time is able to provide them with resources that they would not otherwise have. And they know that's not a good thing, but clearly it would be better for us if we cared about terrorism in Africa, if we cared about these Somalian people who are dying and being otherwise tortured, we would invest in or support local initiatives rather than doing what we're doing now, which is carrying out a lethal and illegal airstrike campaign that has been reported to kill civilians. So, and that started under the Obama administration, make no mistake, but Trump has escalated it, and he's sort of played into the narrative of we're helping, we're good, while under the cover doing horrible things that ruin stability and cause further economic and human costs.
Okay, Caroline, thank you. I want to give Greg a chance to come back on that. Are we conflating aid and security policy, and are we thereby at risk of actually missing the significance of the aid that you were talking about? Anyway, what's your response?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I've always been much more of a proponent of investment, not aid. Aid's sort of been a failure for a long time, and what the US DFIs are trying to do, as well as the private sector, we have a lot of private equity money going into the region, is you can't have security without economic uplift, and you can't have economic uplift without some degree of security. And I think the US is going to do their best to avoid armed conflict. What we're doing in Mozambique is supporting the military through training, and when I say we, the US government and other governments, but also trying to get some economic uplift and investing in businesses that are sustainable. And by sustainable, I mean profitable. And so it can't just be subsistence farming, for example, in the agricultural sectors in Malawi and Mozambique, for example. I just pick on those two because we're involved there. But I think what's important is that there's export crops, not exploitation. We're not talking about multinationals coming in and pillaging the earth. That's what China does in Africa, in the regions that we're involved in. We're trying to displace China, who really do, pillage not only the people, but they pillage the earth and take advantage of it, and without any sort of sustainability. So what we're trying to do is bring Western capital, American capital, but also Western and American values in terms of how businesses operate and what we pay attention to. and then create some export ability for the people that live there. And that's where you get economic uplift. And that's when they stop recruiting young people that are unemployed. Young 18-year-olds without jobs are a really bad formula in terms of the jihadist recruiting. And so we see that in northern Mozambique especially. And the best thing we can do is provide security when it's needed, but more importantly, provide alternatives, which is economic uplift and job creation. Okay,
Greg, thanks. I'm deeply conscious that none of us are in northern Madagascar now, and it's so hard to assess the nuances of the impact of these massive schemes on real lives without being there. It's especially hard with a COVID pandemic preventing people doing a great deal of the reporting that we used to do, and that I hope Tortoise will go on to do. But we did have a bit of a segue there. Thank you, Greg. China. And while we've still got you, I'd like to come back to what you wrote, in a sense, to the brute contest for global leadership. You wrote in a piece which is in the November issue, I presume of the actual printed magazine, The Atlantic, that China is rewriting the operating language of the international system so that it benefits autocracies. I can't even read my own writing, but instead of democracies. And you make the argument that this is happening under our very noses, in particular under the noses of the US foreign policy establishment, without proper pushback. But let me put the other view, which is this at last is an administration which has stood up to China on intellectual property. It sent destroyers through the Taiwan Strait. Is there anything to that?
So the difficulty with the Trump administration is that it often has more than one foreign policy running at the same time. I mean, this was most obviously and famously clear in Ukraine, where the State Department had one policy and then Trump had a private policy, which was to try and get the Ukrainian president to launch an illegal case, an illegal investigation into his political rival. But you can see it on China as well, where there are these kind of different strands of the relationship going, and there's no evident strategy. And so there's a lot of harsh language about China that you get, for example, from Mike Pompeo. That's gone along with a lot of, very friendly language from Trump directed at the leader, at Xi, the Chinese dictator, which particularly before the coronavirus meant that Trump needed a new scapegoat. And you can see these sort of different things going at the same time. I mean, one of the most peculiar elements of the Trump policy towards China has actually been the trade war, where there is a case for a united American, European, maybe Japanese, South Korean, kind of democratic, united trade policy towards China that pushes back against violations of intellectual property, pushes back against corrupt practices, pushes back against Chinese theft of technology. And there are all kinds of issues there that could have been dealt with and could be better dealt with, as a democratic bloc. China needs to trade with all of us, not just with the US. But instead of doing this, the Trump administration launched these kind of uncoordinated trade wars with China, with Europe, with Mexico, all at the same time. And as a result of which it's not clear that it's had any impact. And, it's left Europeans very confused about what their attitude to China should be. And I know there's a lot of talk in Europe about how to rethink this. I mean, the main point in my article was that what the Trump administration seems to have actually facilitated was China's gradual takeover of a lot of international institutions, both inside the UN and around it, in ways that that seem subtle but are becoming increasingly important. Actually, you alluded to it a minute ago when you talked about companies taking Taiwan off their maps. That's the kind of thing that China now does routinely inside the UN and other institutions. So, for example, China really loves the word sovereignty and tries to insert it into lots of documents. And that's because for China, sovereignty means, you can't criticize us. So if we decide to beat up on the Uyghurs or we repress the people of Hong Kong, we don't want to hear, no criticism from the outside is legitimate. And the Trump administration, instead of pushing back against this way of using language inside the UN and elsewhere, has actually enhanced it by going on and on about sovereignty itself. And instead of seeking to reinforce or find new ways to push for transparency, to force China and other autocratic regimes, I should say, to hold to international agreements about human rights and other things, we've kind of given up on that whole world and said, we don't like the way China behaves in these institutions, and so we quit. And the damage that will be done simply by pulling out of the WHO alone is pretty incalculable. I mean, you can dislike the WHO, you can dislike the person who currently runs it, but this is the world's premier public health institution for many, many countries, including many in Africa, which we were just talking about. This is the institution that through which people get vaccines, they get medicine. For countries that don't have their own pharmaceutical industry, the WHO is their source. For countries that don't have strong public health information, this is where they get it. And for the United States to say we're leaving it, that leaves China, an open field to control and influence the way public health is discussed around the world. And this is kind of insanity,
Right.
And this, so this wholesale retreat has simply, in all kinds of ways, I mean, I detailed them in this article, but has left the field open for China to set new norms and to change the way the rules are written.
It's fascinating. But let's take briefly the WHO and what was the I forget the other example, but are we not about to see the miracle of democracy in action? Oh, sorry, and the COP climate conference system is the other one. Is it not entirely plausible now that more or less on November the 4th, there will be a 180-degree turn in US policy on involvement with the WHO and international climate talks, such that much of that damage is reversed? Or, and forgive me for asking a long question, is there a much more serious problem of personnel? Michael Lewis wrote his book about the hollowing out of the federal government, essentially. And there are some who say, and few people know more about sort of the workings of global democracy than you, that simply too many people have left the State Department to restaff it properly, quickly. Is that going to be a break on the kind of swift reversal that I'm dreaming of?
So
I shouldn't have said that.
One of the things I'm most afraid of is that people will come back into the Biden administration and say, okay, now we can just resume where we left off 4 years ago, as if nothing had happened. And that is clearly not the case. And is potentially very damaging. I mean, I think the State Department probably now is in need of very deep reform and rethinking. You're probably right that a new generation of people has to be attracted to work in diplomacy. The same is true for US. I mean, I don't think you can just walk back into the UN system and say, all right, we're back, everything's fine. I think we need, deep rethink of how we're going to engage in international institutions too. So I don't think anything about the next 4 years is going to be swift and easy.
Right, thank you. Now, Turi, forgive me, I'm not going to try to, Turi Munthi in the chat is asking a question. I'd like to know what you think yourself. If we can come to you, Turi, pose the question, but also let us know what you think. I'm talking about where you've asked whether Anne and Ian believe the radicalization of politics will die down.
Yes, that was my question, both in Ian and Anne's fabulous commentary here. A question as to whether the kind of radicalization of politics that you see in the US, but of course we see across Western Europe, very much in Eastern Europe, you mentioned Duterte, Bolsonaro and others, whether a new president on November the 4th, with a change of tone, I think Giles used that word, changes the balance here, whether it sort of realigns us, whether it reduces that polarization, or whether the causes of this sort of, I suppose, political polarization on either side are more systemic than that. Is that part of the long term as well?
Ian, what's your take on whether Biden could just calm everything down?
Well, I think he will calm things down, but that's not going to lead to the kind of reforms that I think Anne is alluding to. And he'll calm things down. He'll be more gentlemanly. He'll be more of an internationalist and so on and so forth. So on the surface, things can be repaired to some extent. But I think all these international arrangements really do have to be reformed, and also domestically countries have to change a great deal to take the sting out of this this populist revolt. So I'm not going to I hate questions that ask me what it's going to be like in the future, because I have no idea. But I think it will take a great deal more thinking and a great deal more change in both domestically and internationally for things to really calm down. And that may very well happen, but it's not going to happen just because Biden wins the election. I think it's a condition, a necessary condition for things to change, but that alone is not going to do it.
I realize, Ian, that I don't think you ever got to the second part of my original question, which is about the Anglo-American relationship and the neediness that is often behind British requests for America to restate the importance of, I'll say it, the special relationship. Will all the correspondents based there have to go through all that again and turn on a dime and start sucking up to a new administration and persuade them, the new president and his national security staff, to keep on saying that the special relationship is more special than America's relationships with other European countries, even though it's probably not the case? Well,
it wasn't so much, Am I muted or unmuted?
No,
can you hear me? Okay. It wasn't so much correspondents who were sucking up to new presidents in the White House. It was prime ministers or foreign secretaries. But no, I think it'll be different. I mean, the reason I wrote this book, The Churchill Complex, is because I'm of the generation of Europeans that still, I was born after the war, but that still felt that we've been liberated by the English-speaking people. That I still get tears in my eye when I watch The Longest Day and see John Wayne and Robert Mitchum wading through the surf on the beaches of Normandy. And so we grew up with this idea of the Anglo-American world being a beacon of freedom and democracy and openness and internationalism. And now we're seeing both countries that have turned their backs on the world that Churchill and Roosevelt fought for. And it's not a world that's going to come back. And it's not a question of sucking up or anything like that. I think Brexit, in many ways, has damaged Britain's relationship with, in the longer term, with the United States further, because whoever's in the White House is not going to have great sentimental attachments to Britain or indeed even to Europe, but they will think of national interest. And when it comes to national interest, the EU, whatever you might think of the EU, but the EU is a very formidable economic entity. And the EU is going to be more important to the United States than a sort of the British Isles that are detached from it. And no doubt presidents might still feel flattered to go horse riding with the Queen in Windsor and so on, but that's not enough to give the relationship any real substance. So I think actually, even though it looks on the surface as though there's a real rapport between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, and that they're on the same wavelength, and in some ways they are, because they've exploited the same populist rebellion. But I think Brexit has done great damage to whatever was special about the relationship between Britain and the United States. Thank you. In a second, I'd like to come briefly to all three of our guest speakers, again, with one final question, the same one for each of you. Does America have an enduring strength that has endured these past 4 years and will continue to endure and make it a beacon of anything? And if so, what is it? But I appreciate the subject for a book, but we'll try and keep that brief. But first, I want to come to my colleague, Nimmo, because intriguingly,
of all the subjects raised this hour, it is the US and China in Africa that has generated some of the liveliest chat. Nimo, can you articulate the gist of what you've been saying in the chat about the problems associated with comparing Chinese and American activities there?
Well, I need to first say that I'm not an expert on this by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't know, I just think that the dichotomies that have been kind of created between the US and China in terms of their intentions on the continent of Africa have been, in some ways during this conversation, we go in there to, like, you know, promote economic development, to promote democracy, to help out people, to make sure that everything, to in whatever way that, you know, in whatever schema and, like, you know, whatever your view of development is, we're trying to promote things that are ultimately good. However, China goes in to pillage, to do all kinds of, you know, to basically for their own kind of self-serving purposes, without any regard for the citizens or the country that they're going into and exploiting. Whereas I just find that kind of discussion, first of all, about China itself quite Orientalist, quite problematic, even if it's genuinely, like, I think everyone can agree that it is well recorded, the track record of China on the continent. However, to then say that, you know, America is in any way different for the last several decades, you know, the last half century, is kind of a joke, like, in my opinion, because of the various interventions, whether that's military or economic, and like as has already been mentioned briefly, but that, you know, America's hasn't been going on into the continent for altruistic reasons, out of some kind of, you know, benevolent, almost a neo-colonial kind of idea of, like, we're going in to help. No, that hasn't been the case, and I think that everyone can kind of agree on that. So that's just kind of what
Okay, thanks. I suspect that Greg may not be able to agree on that, but since we're nearly out of time and this is a forum for civilized disagreement, let me just ask you, Greg, to summarize what you think is America's most enduring positive value that will define its place in the world over the next 4 years.
Yeah, I think, look, I think this disruptive, the disruptive nature of this president, you know, it's an acquired taste, obviously, and it doesn't poll well in a lot of the world. But what America's actually doing, you know, he built up the military significantly. That's peace through strength. He's not using the military, or he's using it in only, you know, very small and limited ways. And I think that you know, and then the economic benefit for the world. It's, you know, as I said, making America great doesn't necessarily have to be in conflict with making the rest of the world great. And think about the things that we didn't know 4 years ago, even political, you know, followers like all of us on this call. I mean, I didn't really know much about Huawei. I didn't know about Nord Stream 2. I didn't know about the Uyghurs, that's for sure. So I think there's, you know, he's exposed some of the evils in the world for what they are. And I think that, you know, America will continue to lead from the front, not from behind like Obama. There's been mistakes made. I didn't like it when both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump announced they would drop out of the TPP. I think, you know, that having some bilateral functions or multilaterals are important. Not all of them. And I think what the last thing I'll just leave with is if we do have a President Biden, I think I agree with everybody. It's not going to be easy to just flip the switch and go back to where we were. But I do think that some of the things that American voters were unhappy with, like the Paris Accords, who benefited the elites on the coast, but at great expense to the people in the rest of the country, as well as, I don't think the Iran deal is coming back. I think that the deals that the president has done in the Middle East are very constructive in the last 2 months. And that was, by the way, as you know, that the Iran deal has really enabled the mullahs to run around the Middle East with American cash, doing all kinds of nasty things. And and it was never brought to the Senate, and treaties have to be ratified by the Senate. So unless the Senate is taken by the Democrats, I don't think that's coming back. So look, I think I could agree with everybody that it won't just be flipping the switch back, and going back 4 years. There's some things that have come out of this that I think are very positive.
Thanks, Greg. Ian, what'll define America and its place in the world over the next 4 years that is distinct from the personality of the president of the past 4?
Well, I can be fairly brief. I think that if Biden wins with a landslide, and I think he has to win by a landslide for the election to seem legitimate and not cause all kinds of chaos if Trump suddenly claims that he won it and so on. If he wins by a landslide, it'll confirm what I think Churchill or somebody else once said, that the Americans do everything wrong until they find the right solution, and they come out on with the right solution at the end. And it still has a system, sclerotic though it is. I mean, the electoral system in America really does need to be reformed. The electoral colleges shouldn't be there at all. You shouldn't have a Supreme Court full of judges who have taken sort of Calvinist attitude to an 18th century document. There are lots of things that are really wrong with the system, have to be changed, but the system will be seen to still work. And that's more than you can say about most countries in the world. And it's one of the reasons we looked up to the United States, not because of any individual inhabitant of the White House. Some of them we liked, some of them we didn't, but it still has a system where people are free to speak out, free to oppose, free to criticize, and free to change government and kick the rascals out. And as long as that works, there is still hope.
Thank you very much. Thanks also to Chris in the chat for giving us that quote, even though misattributed, so perhaps I won't read it out. I will. You can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Thank heavens that they try. So should we all. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Anne, who's had to leave. Thank you, Nimo and my colleagues, Ella, amongst others. I think we've agreed that ain't no switch to be flipped on November the 4th, much as we might hope so. There's more a super tanker to steer gently on a different course if possible. But I won't go on right now because we've gone over by 5 minutes. But I think we'll just end by echoing what Ian just said, that whatever you may think of American leadership or lack of it over the past 4 years, that freedom to kick the rascals out, to make a choice is so important. And I think that alone, a lesson to many other parts of the world, including, for example, Belarus just now. Do join us next week for the next installment of Sensemaker Live on America, and the week after, by which time we'll almost be at November the 3rd. Thank you very much and have a good weekend.